His hands and feet were burning.
Bobby was in constant pain.
We never thought this would be a death sentence for him.
One coworker looks at another coworker and, did you do it?
Police didn't know the manner of death, accident, suicide, or homicide.
This was a diabolical, methodical killer.
Who would think that someone could do something so cruel?
Probably the most troublesome case in my entire career.
They thought that someone got away with murder.
A shocking murder becomes a dark mystery. The victim's body holds the key to convicting the killer. Every fiber is a clue. Every wound is a piece of the puzzle. In these cases, it's up to the medical examiner to find the crucial evidence and catch the murderer. This is Secrets of the Morgue.
We sit in the northeastern part of Pennsylvania. We're on the fringe of the Pocono Mountains. It's a historically old mining town. People are hardworking, blue-collar families.
It's a good community, close-knit community. 3 or 4 colleges in the area. They're nice people. They get along with each other.
Early one morning, paramedics rush 32-year-old electrician Robert Curley to hospital.
Robert Curley was losing his hair. His skin was inflamed. He was hallucinating.
This wasn't Robert's first visit to emergency. He'd been in and out of hospital for the past 11 months.
Initially, he was diagnosed as having a nervous disease called Guillain-Barré, which starts in the lower extremities.
His hands and feet were burning, and he had terrible trouble walking.
He was in constant pain. They couldn't even put a sheet on his body because it would hurt the pain to the point where morphine wasn't even helping.
After 2 days at a specialized medical center, doctors question Robert's initial diagnosis. But they don't yet know the cause of the young man's intense pain.
One of the doctors there said, the only thing that hasn't been done is to do a special forensic toxicology test. They found that he had a high level of thallium in his blood. Thallium could be used to kill mice and rats as a pesticide because it accumulates in the blood and causes neurological and even hematological abnormalities that kills the animal.
It previously had been the key ingredient in rat poison. And in the late 1960s, the EPA banned it because of how deadly and toxic it was to people.
Thallium poisoning can be really tricky because the symptoms mimic symptoms of so many other illnesses. It is a heavy metal that has no flavor, has no odor, is easily dissolved in a solution. If there's thallium poisoning and it goes undetected, the effects on the body include paralysis, and renal failure, and death.
Just hours after doctors discover thallium in Robert's blood, he slips into a coma.
The medical staff was unable to save him, and he passed away, unfortunately. I believe it was September 27th.
When I found out that Bobby had passed, I was very heartbroken.
never thought that this would be a death sentence for him. We just thought he was ill, he would get the appropriate doctors, and he'd get the appropriate care, and he'd be fine.
Robert's friends and family are desperate to know how this could have happened.
I first met Bobby in 1979. Bobby was a year ahead of me in electrical school. He took me under his wing, even though he was 4 or 5 years younger than me. We were both transferred to the same job at the same time and became immediate friends. If you ever had a problem, he was there at any time to help you out.
He was outgoing, he was a real jokester. He could pick up a conversation with anyone.
Robert Curley's body is sent to the local coroner's office for autopsy.
The public knows medical examiners often by high-pressure, high-publicity cases. When those are less than 1% of the work we do, most of the work we do are ordinary people who die under questionable circumstances.
Former chief medical examiner for the state of New York, Dr. Michael Bodden, has performed thousands of autopsies.
What appeals to me is to be able to explain to families how and why their loved one died.
The coroner's first job is to unlock the exact circumstances of Robert's death.
They didn't know the manner of death, accident, suicide, or homicide.
Where did the thallium come from? The coroner knew that Bob and a number of coworkers were working at the Wilkes University chemistry lab on a remodeling project. Some very quick investigation determined that there was, in fact, thallium present in that laboratory.
Government health and safety officials launch an inquiry into Robert Curley's death.
It's a federal agency that deals with workplace accidents and why the accident occurred, were there unsafe procedures or unsafe practices in place. Law enforcement was not involved. There was no police investigation.
All of Robert's co-workers are tested for thallium poisoning, but not a single one has any thallium in their blood.
Thallium poisoning is rare in the state of Pennsylvania.
The workplace inquiry turns up no new information, and the mystery around Robert's death continues to build.
So it wasn't for a few months that the coroner was able to make a final judgment that it was thallium poisoning and it was homicide.
Someone deliberately poisoned the much-loved 32-year-old electrician.
Typically, in any homicide, the first 48 hours are the most important to gain the most information possible under the best of circumstances. In this situation, a law enforcement investigation didn't begin until much later, which really put that investigation behind the 8 ball before it even began.
The lack of crucial time-sensitive information is a huge challenge for investigators. DA Peter Paul Olszewski is determined to solve the baffling murder.
We knew that somebody out there was responsible for his death.
Investigators look into Robert's life to see if there is anyone who would have wanted him dead.
Poisoning is an intimate crime, and it requires close contact with the victim, because you don't always poison somebody on the first dose. Sometimes it's progressive. Sometimes it's the chemicals are added into the food over a period of time so that there's a level that's built up that becomes toxic.
Investigators scrutinize those closest to Robert. They start with his wife, Joanne. The newlyweds have been together for just over a year.
The first time I met her, she was smiling, very, very cordial, very nice. She had a certain strength about her. And of course, she had lost her first husband, so I guess and she had a baby girl. So she had to be tough to move on.
Joanne Curley's first husband died in an accident. One of her friends said to her that you have to get out and, get back into society. At which time she did, and she went to a local bar in Wilkes-Barre at that time and met Robert Curley.
He called me and he said, I have somebody I want you to meet. So they came over, and we got along wonderfully, right from the beginning. We spent a lot of time together.
We'd go out for pizza a lot, different places, and the kids were always fine together, and we just meshed together well.
It's 2 months into the marriage when Robert Curley begins to fall ill. Investigators look carefully at Joanne.
Generally speaking, people are not killed by strangers. They're killed by somebody they know. And people generally have a relationship of some kind to their assailant. Whether it's a spouse, whether it's a parent, whether it's a sibling, those are the people that can generate enough animus against you that would cause them to kill you.
We couldn't find anybody to say that she was cheating. We couldn't find anybody to say that Bobby was cheating.
By all accounts, it was a happy, healthy marriage without any major problems.
When I talked to her on the phone, she would be saying, why is this happening to me? I lost my first husband. Why is this happening?
Joanne seems devastated, but investigators take a closer look at her behavior.
After they left the hospital, the day that he died, that they went to Robert Curley's mother's house, where he had an antique Cadillac. Joanne Curley demanded the keys to and took that vehicle that night.
There wasn't that sorrow that you'd think a wife would have.
And I took food over to the house for Joanne after his passing. When we got to the door, one of her old friends from high school answered the door. And I thought it was kind of funny that he was there the day after Bobby died.
Joanne Curley's conduct was clearly suspicious, and we needed to know, did she kill her husband?
Investigators sift through Robert Curley's life to see who might have wanted to kill him. His widow's behavior has placed her at the top of the suspect list.
Without exception, the spouse is always going to be considered the #1 suspect. It's no secret that men typically resort to violent means to eliminate their problems, whereas women tend to turn to less gory methods such as poisoning.
We asked Joanne to submit to a polygraph test, which she agreed.
There are 2 stages to a polygraph test. The first is the pre-test interview. And in my experience, that pre-test interview is far more productive because it's a series of questions that can go on for hours. And oftentimes, that's where the confession comes from, is before anybody's even wired up. The second part is the actual analysis of the data that comes off of the polygraph. And everybody interprets it differently.
Polygraphs are inadmissible in evidence in Pennsylvania, as in most states, but they're a good tool for investigators. And when she was administered that test, Joanne came out truthful in all of her responses to all of the relevant questions.
Investigators still need more to rule out Joanne as a person of interest.
The law enforcement officers did a search of the Curley residence for thallium.
Dozens of Robert's belongings are sent to the State Police Crime Laboratory for testing. Investigators also request blood samples.
It really was fundamental to inquire whether Joanne and their daughter had any thallium in their blood. When those samples were tested in the toxicology lab, lo and behold, there were higher than normal levels of thallium, both of them. Was somebody trying to kill this whole family? Bob, Joanne, and their daughter.
The key for investigators becomes locating the source of the poison.
They scoured the house. They even took apart drains in his kitchen sink and took the liquid that was in there and had it tested for thallium.
Police rule out Joanne as the source of the poison. But investigators do find thallium on something belonging to Robert. Something he used on a daily basis.
He would take a lunch bucket and a metal thermos, and every day he would take iced tea for his lunch and throughout the day. Forensic testing at the Pennsylvania State Police Crime Lab then determined that there was traces of thallium on the tops of the rim of the thermos.
It's clear to investigators that Robert was the only target. The rest of the family must have accidentally absorbed a little poison.
It all comes back to the thallium, who had access to it and where it came from.
Detectives turn their attention back to Wilkes College. It's the only place linking Robert and thallium.
There was no other area where there was, in fact, thallium, or how someone could obtain it. You legally couldn't buy thallium, and no one else had it in their possession except the college.
Investigators reconstruct what unfolded in the chemistry lab to find out if his co-workers could be involved.
Initial investigators thought that it was a prank gone bad from one of the other employees putting thallium in a container thinking that it wouldn't harm him, it would just make him sick. I know from investigative experiences, construction workers always play games with each other just to pass the time away.
Bobby was quite the pranksters. We had a lot of fun on the jobs, and all good fun. You know, we'd tie something to somebody's bumper. We were working at a hospital years ago, and one of the guys, he was germophobic, and Bobby found a bedpan and put it on the seat of his Cadillac, his car, and he nearly had a fit, and he knew who did it. And it wasn't a dirty bedpan, but it was quite hilarious, standing at a distance and watching him try to get into his car with his bedpan sitting on the seat. So we had a lot of fun with Bobby.
Investigators speculate whether the young man's death is the result of a joke gone horribly wrong.
Well, we were interviewed, and their theory was that being that Bobby was a prankster, some of the electricians on the job pulled a prank on Bobby and put what they thought was something similar to Valium in his iced tea, and thinking that thallium and Valium are probably the same. I couldn't believe that that was their idea, because we may be electricians, but we're not stupid. We're not working in the kitchen, and you know, you're putting paprika in somebody's food. You're working in a chemistry lab with poison signs all over the place.
If Robert's death wasn't the result of a prank, investigators need to consider if one of the co-workers acted deliberately.
They might have had some animosity towards Bob because he was the foreman. He was a little bit younger than them. They had more time working for the company that he did.
As co-workers were interviewed, they cooperated completely, and as part of that process, the co-workers were asked to take polygraph examinations. They all agreed. When asked flat out, were they involved in administering thallium to Bob, they all categorically denied that. But the polygraphic results showed that they were being deceptive in those responses. That immediately cast doubt on them and cast them into the position as possible suspects.
Police scrutiny of Robert's coworkers drives a wedge into the town.
A lot of the co-workers had children, and being that it was a close-knit area, there was other children saying, you know, your daddy killed someone, your daddy poisoned someone. So it was very tough for all the co-workers, and they were being accused, so they all sought legal counsel. They denied any involvement in the case, and they became reluctant to talk.
Investigators look for evidence to tie the co-workers to Robert's death.
When the investigators now looked into their backgrounds and any possible motivation they might have in killing Bob, whether as a prank or whether intentionally in some way, that investigation went nowhere.
The diligence required to eliminate all of Robert's co-workers as suspects takes investigators nearly a year.
Every homicide investigator will come to a point in their careers where you get to that place where there is nobody left to interview, where you have received the results of every forensic test you have submitted, where the tips have ended, and where you have exhausted every investigative avenue possible. In its simplest form, there's nowhere left to go. And that means you go back into the box and you reread everything and you give it to somebody who can put some fresh eyes on it.
Refusing to let the case turn cold, District Attorney Olszewski looks beyond his state's borders.
I was trying another first-degree murder case and had been working with Michael Baden, the chief medical examiner in the state of New York, and candidly, the world's leading forensic pathologist. I told him about the Curley case.
He asked me if I had any suggestions as to how to proceed.
He talked to me about some potential forensic testing that can be done as long as certain specimens were appropriately taken from the first autopsy.
Dr. Baden joins the hunt to bring Robert's killer to justice. He has a long and illustrious career working on many high-profile cases like JonBenet Ramsey, O.J. Simpson, and JFK. Dr. Baden reviews the first coroner's autopsy and spots a glaring oversight.
Hair samples weren't taken. Thallium, once it gets in the hair, it stays in the hair while the hair is growing. So we can tell when the person was given thallium or given a number of other drugs.
So an incomplete autopsy is a fundamental error in any criminal homicide prosecution, and clearly in this case, the coroner had produced an incomplete, inconclusive autopsy.
A complete autopsy is essential because that's the information that the homicide investigators will use to form some kind of direction in their investigation.
It's discouraging, I must say, when the autopsy isn't done right.
To track down Robert's killer, Dr. Baden is prepared to get the right evidence from the victim's body. But there is a major obstacle.
In this case, the evidence that we needed to convict somebody was left in the ground. And we needed to do an exhumation to see if we could find Bob Curley's killer.
The investigation into the murder of Robert Curley has hit a wall. The tight-knit community of Wilkes-Barre is in an uproar.
Every other day there was something in the paper, something new, something old. The media coverage was a terrible reminder of it all the time.
They thought that someone got away with murder.
That's all people talked about because it was always on the front page of the paper. It was still too hurtful. So you didn't ask family members. Everybody would try to guess, well, gee, what do you think happened? Well, you know, nobody knew.
We had an unsolved murder case. We had a family that was grieving. And on a daily basis, we had the media printing stories and authoring editorials indicating that they believe the investigation was going too slow and that an arrest should be made. This case was probably the most troublesome case in my entire career. It's a lot of pressure for the investigators, it's a lot of pressure for the prosecutor.
Determined to find the perpetrator behind this cruel murder, Dr. Michael Bodden proposes a novel forensic toxicology test.
There is a new technique now, segmental analysis of the hair, where not only can you find thallium in hair, but one can determine when the thallium was given because the hair grows about half an inch a month. Thallium doesn't disappear from the body, even for years and years afterwards.
There are those little scientific tests and samples that need to be taken by the forensic pathologist and analyzed that play a big part in an investigation.
In 1994, the process of segmental hair analysis is in its infancy.
At the initial autopsy, although the presence of thallium was confirmed, they were not aware of the work that had been done on the segmental hair analysis. Curley was the first case that I really was involved in testing this procedure.
Dr. Bodden hopes the new technique will provide investigators with the break they need.
This would be the first time in Pennsylvania history that we would use this type of evidence. And in the entire country, it had only been admitted in one courtroom. And the problem could be that on the eve of trial, the court could rule that that evidence was not reliable enough. And if the court excluded our forensic evidence, case was over.
It's a gamble D.A. Olszewski is willing to take. Investigators could use segmental hair analysis to create a timeline of poisonings to build a pool of suspects.
As a result of my conversation with Dr. Bodden, it was evident that we needed to have, from the initial autopsy, hair samples. We had a discussion about the possibility of doing an exhumation and going in a second time and, in fact, getting them. We needed court approval, and we needed approval of the next of kin. That was Joanne Curley.
D.A. Olszewski obtains legal permission for exhumation. Robert's widow gives her full consent. But the team faces a major hurdle. Since Robert has been buried for nearly 3 years, there may be no viable strands of hair left to test.
Whenever exhumation is considered, the first thing the police will ask the forensic pathologist is, what's the condition of the body going to be like? And the answer that I give is, we can't tell. Some bodies remain in good condition for decades. Other bodies will deteriorate and decompose considerably within 6 months. The drier a body is, usually the better it's preserved.
Nearly 3 years after Robert Curley's death, the exhumation of his body begins.
The casket had been covered by a cement liner, which is commonly done now, where the casket itself doesn't go right into the ground, but a concrete liner is placed around it to keep water out.
As the casket is pulled up, the team makes an appalling discovery.
The cement liner was filled with water.
Significant amounts of water were running from the casket. The fear that we had is that water would degrade the hair samples that we needed for testing. We knew at that point that we had a serious problem.
As the exhumation of Robert Curley's body begins, investigators are horrified to discover a waterlogged grave.
When we saw all the water pouring out of the casket, we were all taken aback and had serious concerns now about whether we would have success in the re-autopsy. At that point, all our hopes that we had any evidence at all rested in Michael Baden's hands and his ability to successfully gain that evidence from the body that had been buried for approximately 3 years.
There was a chance there that there might be too much decomposition of the body to be able to do any toxicology studies.
When I saw the casket opened and I saw the body, it looked like he was possibly buried within the last month. And it was 3 years that he was buried.
To our amazement, the body was in very good condition.
The constant temperature deep within the cold, wet Pennsylvania ground preserved Robert Curley's body.
When I saw Robert Curley with hair, I became excited knowing that now we have some new evidence in the case.
The discovery is exactly what the investigation needs to move the case forward.
That's when Dr. Baden took over, and if anybody could recover these samples, it was Mike Baden.
Dr. Baden begins the second autopsy with a meticulous extraction of hair samples.
We do segmental analysis to determine approximately how many months before death the drug was given. The entire investigation needed to know that in order to focus as to who could have been responsible.
Dr. Baden and his team carefully analyze each segment of every hair sample.
Each time the thallium is taken into the body, it goes to hair roots and stays in the hair root until it's cut off. Each segment will tell us how many different times the thallium was in his blood, and when the first time it was given, and how often it was given.
Dr. Baden and his colleagues build a scientific timeline of the poisoning of Robert Curley.
Where we found at least 10 or so separate spots in the hair, and the oldest one being before he started working at Wilkes University Laboratory.
It was possibly maybe even 3 months or more before he was working at the Wilkes College chemistry lab that he was getting doses of thallium.
Amazingly, that analysis totally debunked the theory that Wilkes University was the source of the thallium. It totally debunks the theory that the electricians were involved. And now, everybody in the world is a suspect until excluded.
To find Robert's killer, investigators look at who he was with each time he was poisoned.
We were able to do a chart of all the dates on which Bob Curley ingested the thallium. We compiled a list of names of all the people who had contact with Bob Curley on each ingestion date. The job then became to begin the process of exclusion. And we knew that the killer had to have contact with Bob Curley on each and every ingestion date.
As Dr. Baden completes the autopsy, he makes one more crucial discovery.
The additional bonus was that there was food in the stomach. Once we die, we don't process our food anymore. The food that's from our last meal stays in our stomach. And in this instance, the food showed a large amount of thallium, which indicated immediately that he had been given the thallium while in the hospital.
The largest thallium dose that he received was at the Hershey Medical Center in Hershey, Pennsylvania, the night before he died.
That was information that obviously was never available to us previously, and it was significant information that just took the investigation into high gear. So we went from a potential list of approximately 25 suspects down to a list of about 5 individuals. Now the question was, who's the killer?
Thanks to a trailblazing second autopsy, investigators are closing in on Robert Curley's killer.
When we learned that poisonings occurred while he was a patient in the hospital, we knew that the killer came to his hospital room.
Talked to the people there, the nurses that were working with Bob Curley to find out who visited him at the hospital.
Dr. Bodden finds the key to solving the case in the victim's Last Supper.
What was in his stomach was something that he had taken a few hours before he died.
Now, we zeroed in on 2 or 3 people, the family that had access to his food. The night before he died, Joanne Curley brought his favorite food to the hospital, which was pizza. She was the only one that was feeding him. We were 100% sure that it was coming from Joanne.
The only person who could have given him the thallium was his wife.
Detectives still need to connect this Black Widow to a source of the rare banned poison.
We looked at the reports and we broke up into teams. The one team investigators come back and says that they discovered after talking to a neighbor of Joanne Curley's deceased grandmother, Joanne Curley's grandmother had this jar in the basement with this white powder in that was a rat poison. Now, all of a sudden, we have another source of where thallium could come from.
Investigators search the grandmother's former residence for the thallium, but they come up empty. They need another way to make the connection.
The neighbor saw it there and knew it was there. And the other investigators did mention that Joanne's brother indicated that this jar with the white powder was there.
So, while I wasn't able to put the smoking gun in her hand, so to speak, we certainly had circumstantial evidence. But more importantly, we were able to show that he died of thallium poison, that he received it in the hospital, and we were able to show that the person who was there each and every time was Joanne Curley.
In July of 1997, Joanne is charged with the killing of Robert Curley.
She was arrested for first-degree murder, premeditated murder.
Obviously, in a trial, we would have to convince a jury that she was a diabolical, methodical killer. The problem was that there were many friends, neighbors, and relatives who gave testimony that Joanne Curley was a good and loving wife, that she loved her husband, that she was a good mother, that she would never, ever, ever do anything to harm Bob.
But the greatest obstacle facing the prosecution isn't the veneer of a kind and caring widow.
The science was the evidence we needed to convict, but the problem was it had never been admissible in a court of law before in Pennsylvania. And if the court excluded our forensic evidence, case was over. And Joanne Curley would have walked out of that courtroom a free woman.
Then, Joanne Curley offers to confess on one condition.
Defense counsel offered a plea of third-degree murder in exchange for dropping our intention to convict her of first-degree murder and a death penalty. Ultimately, the family was unanimous. Mom, brother, and sister all agreed that they would like us to take the plea to third-degree murder. They wanted finality. They wanted Joanne Curley to tell the whole world that she was responsible.
Joanne Curley confesses to the ruthless, prolonged poisoning of her husband. She even went as far as poisoning her own child with thallium to steer suspicion away from her.
This was an evil woman. She was a diabolical woman.
Well, I thought that she would have gotten an Academy Award for her acting, because she had me thinking that it couldn't have been her. No way, no how.
Who would think that someone could do something so cruel just because you're dissatisfied? Did she want his money from his annuity, from the life insurance, that badly? I guess she did. From the day that she was taken in handcuffs to the magistrate, Larry and I had never seen her, talked to her, heard from her again. And that's fine by us.
Dr. Bodden and investigators' refusal to give up on this cold, mystifying case are what finally brought Robert's killer to justice 6 long years after his murder.
Whenever investigators are investigating a suspicious death, it's absolutely fundamentally critical that they work closely with the forensic pathologist and the medical examiner in the case. The amount of evidence that could be collected during an autopsy is nearly endless.
In this case, it turned out that I was aware of certain new ways of testing hair to hunt for truth. Out of the 1 million doctors there are in the country, less than 400 full-time practicing forensic pathologists. Being able to provide an expertise that is not common in this country is very important.
It was through the forensic testing and the skills of Dr. Bodden that this case was solved. It was amazing.